Hi, I'm your host, Jess Carter, and on this episode of Data Driven Leadership, we're diving into scaling data and analytics. Specifically, what we want to look at is where should you get started if you want to build a meaningful foundation around your data and analytics. We're going to get this answer in the first few minutes of our show, and afterwards, we've got two experts who'll give us a real-life example and dive into their story. To help me solution on the spot is Brittany Goodwin, our data modeler at Resultant. Hey, Brittany, how are you?
I'm doing well, Jess. How are you doing today?
I am good. You've had a really fun, interesting career in data. Could you just kind of walk us through who is Brittany and what is the role that you're playing now and sort of what other things have you done around data?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been at Resultant for about 2.5 years now. And the first part of kind of my journey at Resultant, I was working with Project Excellence, and I was primarily doing business analysis type work, primarily working on some application development projects that were pretty data focused. And it was around supply chain risk analysis and aggregating data from all different types of places. But I was really on more the BA business analysis side, working with the client directly, figuring out what the application needed to do, what we were trying to achieve with it, and how we could use all those data sources to actually do that.
Very cool.
Recently, I transitioned over to working more on the technical side with the data architecture team. So I am doing some BI development, working directly with data there, as well as doing data modeling work primarily for IDOE.
That is so cool. Do you, what's the part of working with data that you're the most passionate about? Where do you get lost in working with data, where you just kind of look up and realize time has flown by?
Yeah, I think it's all the possibilities of what is actually in the data. So I think a lot of times, understanding what we're trying to do first and foremost is most important. But then you start looking into data and you're like, yeah, we can definitely achieve that. But also, here's all this other stuff that maybe you guys didn't realize is actually in your data and how that can be tied to your original use case or how we can use those additional data points to help solve some of the other use cases that clients have.
That's awesome. Very cool. Well, okay, so we're going to do solution on the spot, and we're in this together. So the scenario for us today is we've walked into a potential client meeting, and they've sat us down to say, we need your help. They're a enterprise level, large organization with, we'll say, more than 7 large enterprise systems that don't integrate easily. And they've been down a path to try to scale their data and analytics. And essentially, they're just not getting where they need to. They want some visualization. They want some pipelining. They want a warehouse. They want all these cool things. And so we're walking in stuck between, they kind of wanted some quick wins, and they've now not gotten those. But we also need to make sure they get the foundation right. And so as we step into that, where do you begin the conversation with them?
Yeah, I think that scenario is probably more common than people actually realize if they don't work with that stuff every day, as you think these big organizations have the most developed data strategy ever, when most of them don't. I think in that scenario, first place to start, I think most companies will look at what tools are out there. What software can we implement? What databases do we need? What visualizations are we going to create?
Yeah.
But the first step is really what are we trying to achieve? Going one step behind that, and what is the strategy? What are we trying to create? Who is going to be using this data? Who are we creating these visuals for? How is this data going to actually help them make decisions in their everyday job? So I think kind of taking a step back before we get to what tools we want to use and actually analyzing the strategy of how they're trying to do this and why they're trying to do it.
Well, and even that, right? How many times do we walk into and they have an opinion about the tool? Hey, we're halfway through building it out in Tableau, Power BI. We've got a half-built warehouse. We really don't want to give up on this path, right? Is it painful for you to see when a client is immediately kind of entrenched in some assumptions about tools, or are you sort of okay with that and largely it plays out? Like, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it depends on kind of what tool they're attached to and why they're attached to it. I mean, I think as consultants, if they've invested in this tool and, they need to use it, obviously we're going to try to do our best to take that into consideration, but it's not always the best path forward. So I think, like always, it's, pros and cons of maybe this isn't the best tool for you guys to be using, but if we can back up a step and figure out, like, let's look at your strategy first and then see from there, what can we salvage from what you guys have already done? And what are the pros and cons of stripping it out and starting over?
That's awesome. Well, and if we're in this situation where they do want some progress. So you can tell they're feeling the burn on, like, we wanted some results. We wanted to show off to the C-level. We were excited to show the ELT what we were doing. I mean, we kind of do our best to figure out, are there some quick wins that we can get them one way or another, even if there's sunk cost and we're like, listen, bad news, it just is the wrong platform.
Yeah.
Like, even if that's the case and we can explain that, walk them through why, because I feel like we are pretty passionate about, we understand the pressure to keep things that they've already spent money on. And if we really think that's not going to serve you for your scaled analytics in 4 years, 2 years, like, we really feel the responsibility to say that out loud and still create opportunities to say, we can iterate quickly over here and get you the 3 biggest pain points and kind of push those out quickly, right? And sort of figure out, are those visualizations or 3 data sources that you need to pipe into their data warehouse, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think we do that a lot of, iterations. And okay, our first iteration, we're going to target whatever your biggest pain point is, or whatever what's a quick win for you guys. Can we prioritize out of all these different dashboards you want to make? Is there one dashboard or a specific section of that that's really important?
Yeah.
And let's focus on that, use what we can to get that out the door, and get that to the people who need it. And then we can continue to iterate. And I don't think that, even if we know maybe that's not the right tool, it's not a waste. I know that I've been on projects before where we'll do one iteration knowing that that's not going to be the final step.
Right.
And we know that we're going to iterate, we're going to change later on, but the things that we learn from doing that first iteration always make the second iteration better. So it's definitely not a waste, because we are getting people what they need quickly, and because we're learning a lot before we move on to the next step.
Okay, so one of the things I want to pick your brain about here, though, is, like, when it comes to iteratively building out a scaled data analytics platform, I, as a non-data modeler, might think, how do you know the way you're iterating isn't sunk cost? Like, how do you know you're building this dashboard in a way that is truly modular, and that we can move the right things around at the right time? And so, like, I don't know, like, how do you address some of that?
Yeah, so doing that kind of on one project currently, and we're doing this iteration, we're going to do this in iterations, right? But we know that the underlying data model, we don't want to have to rip out the data model and start over, because that takes a lot of time. That's kind of, part of your base, part of your foundation. So we put a lot of thought into how do we design a model for the data that can feed not only the, application or the dashboards we're doing now, but also what are some other use cases that this client has, and can we build the model in a way that, obviously, we're going to prioritize the first dashboards or the first application, but we're also not going to back ourselves into a corner where, when we do the next iteration of whatever we're doing, where we have to start over on the data model and create a new one.
That makes sense.
So doing data models that are modular, that, sometimes we bring in data sets or data fields that aren't 100% required for the first iteration of this, but we know bringing it in now is going to save us time later on in the road. Then if it's easier to do it now, we'll go ahead and do it now. So just making things a little bit more, you can move them around easier, but also just thinking forward and, like, what other things can I put in here that will make our lives easier to be able to achieve things faster in our next iteration.
Well, and you've gotten to work on the platform, the back end, and the front end. Like, you've kind of gotten to touch projects on like all around 3D, right? Engagement here. What's the in this kind of scenario where they do want some quick wins, but maybe they're in a mess and they're halfway done and need us to step in? It's like usually the hardest challenge, in your opinion.
I think one of the hardest things we come to is that in this huge, amount of data that we have, actually pinpointing what people are trying to understand from their data, which is why we try to make that step number one. What are you actually trying to understand better? What problem are you trying to solve? And chances are there's data to support that. There's data to support whatever decision you're trying to make. But if we don't understand that underlying what issue are you looking at, then we end up chasing the wrong data sets, or, we don't build the model correctly. So that's really important, is understanding like exactly what problem they're trying to solve. That seems to be really the hardest part.
Well, and I don't know if it's hard, but like step number 2 maybe, or 3, I'm not sure, on your list is like, with that many source systems and that many enterprise solutions, there's probably a ton of noise. Mm-hmm. There's probably people who do things differently depending on their standard operating procedures and their compliance measures around those. So people use it differently, and the quality of data might be awful where they really thought they were relying on good data, but there's really good data tucked somewhere else where sales is actually putting really good data in their sales pipeline, but no one was pulling that into the warehouse to use it for some sort of forecasting. And so I imagine the noise is like, okay, look, what are we aiming at? And then let's go get kind of all the noise out so we can look at what the critical data is to be our signal. Is that fair?
Oh yeah, for sure. There is a lot of noise when it comes to data. A lot of data that gets collected that people will think is important, but ends up not being important, or is the way they've collected maybe is not, conducive to proper standards. And so you can't really use it for anything. So we do run into that a lot. That's definitely an issue. And it is tough when you're like, oh, well, we've got this great data set. We think it's going to be perfect. And then you start looking into it and you're like, well, actually, you can't use that. It's, garbage in, garbage out is always the saying. If you don't want to put bad data into whatever you're trying to analyze, because the outcomes, it's not going to help you make the proper decision.
Yep, absolutely. So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're kind of saying, hey, get in, understand what their intent is, understand the kinds of triggers or levers they're trying to pull with their data, understand and analyze what is some of the noise and what are the signals they're relying on, maybe evaluate those signals for feedback on if they're strong enough signals to trust to make these kinds of decisions in the first place. And then, like quick wins, sure, we can make some cool visualizations or tuck in a pipeline or two, and do our best to salvage what's already been built when and if we think it's possible. Is that right?
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. I think you just gave us a lecture in 5 minutes flat. So awesome job. Thank you for solutioning on the spot with me.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Jess Carter. Don't forget to follow The Data-Driven Leadership wherever you get your podcasts, and rate and review letting us know how these data topics are transforming your business. We can't wait to see you in our next episode.